My name is Clint West, and before that day in the Rockies, I believed fear was something a man could measure, like weather, distance, daylight, the number of rounds in a bear spray canister, the kilometers back to the truck, the calories left in a pack, the odds of making a river crossing before dusk. But by the time I saw the thing on the cliff above Moraine Creek, I understood that fear was not a number at all. Fear was a country, wide and black and ancient, and once you crossed its border there were no road signs pointing back to the person you had been. I had come into that valley alone because I had been doing too much of everything else with other people, working too many double shifts at the mill outside Hinton, answering too many texts, sitting through too many barbecues where men my age talked about mortgage rates and bad knees and whose kid had moved to Calgary. And I told everyone, including myself, that I needed a weekend in the backcountry to clear my head, but the truth was simpler and worse than that. I wanted silence. I wanted a place where nobody expected anything from me, where the mountains were too big to care whether I was divorced, tired, angry, lonely, or becoming the kind of man who stared at a television he had not turned on. I parked my truck at the old trailhead just after sunrise, locked the doors, checked the cab twice because I always checked things twice, and then I set off north with my pack riding high and my satellite phone clipped to my shoulder strap like a little badge of modern confidence. 30 kilometers of rough trail between me and the truck by the end of the day, 30 kilometers I had planned to hike in, sleep, fish, and hike out of with nothing more dramatic than sore calves and a few photos of mountains reflected in cold water. The morning was beautiful in that sharp Canadian Rockies way that makes a man briefly forgive the world. The air smelled of spruce sap, wet stone, and the ghost of last winter still hiding in the shaded gullies. The mountains rose on both sides of the valley like walls built by giants who had lost interest halfway through the work, leaving cliffs broken, ridges jagged, and slopes littered with boulders the size of cabins. Moraine Creek ran white and fast beside the trail, sliding over black rock, vanishing under snow bridges in places, then bursting out again with a sound like torn cloth. I made good time at first, the kind of good time that makes you proud before it makes you stupid. I crossed 2 avalanche chutes, climbed through an old burn where silver trunks stood like bones, and pushed into thicker timber as the trail narrowed until it was less a path than a rumor passed from boot to boot. I saw a fresh elk sign, bear scat full of berry seeds, and once, in a patch of mud near a seep, a track so large I stopped and stared at it for longer than I should have. It was not clear enough to mean anything. That is what I told myself. Meltwater had widened it. A bear had stepped twice in the same place. Shadows made the heel look longer. A man in the wilderness becomes a lawyer for his own comfort, arguing down every piece of evidence that might require him to turn around. By noon, the sky had changed. Not badly, not yet, but enough that the light went flat and the high peaks lost their hard edges behind veils of moving cloud. I ate lunch on a fallen log beside the creek. Cheese, jerky, 2 dry tortillas, and coffee from a dented thermos. And while I ate, I had the first definite feeling that I was being watched. I do not mean the ordinary watched feeling a man gets in the woods, where every squirrel sounds like an intruder and every crow seems to be reporting on your progress. This was focused. It had weight. It pressed against the back of my neck so steadily that I turned 3 times with my mouth full, expecting to see another hiker standing there. Maybe embarrassed, maybe lost, maybe one of those silent young guys in expensive gear who move through the backcountry like they are training for a war only they know about. But there was nobody. There was only the creek, the trees, the slope rising behind me, and high above that slope a dark cliff band running east to west like a scar across the mountain. I remember looking at that cliff for a long time. I remember how the wind combed the tops of the spruce below it, all of them bending together, and how one dead tree near the base leaned at an impossible angle, stripped of bark, pale as a bone needle against the rock. I remember thinking, for no reason I could name, that something could stand up there and see the whole valley, see the trail, see me, see my red pack cover and my orange bear spray and the little silver flash of my satellite phone whenever I moved. I should have turned around then. That is easy to say now, and useless, because men almost never turn around at the first warning. We respect storms once rain hits our faces. We respect injuries once blood fills the boot. We respect predators once we can see their teeth. But the first warning usually arrives as a feeling, and feelings are embarrassing. So I packed up, tightened my straps, and continued north. The trail climbed away from the creek into denser forest, and the woods changed in a way I did not like. The birds thinned out. The ground became soft with moss. The spruce grew close together, their lower branches dead and gray, dragging across my sleeves like fingers. Twice I heard something moving parallel to me in the timber, not crashing, not snapping branches the way a moose does, but keeping pace with a careful heaviness, a slow, deliberate pressure through the underbrush. I stopped. It stopped. I walked. It walked. I called out once, loud enough that my own voice startled me. "Hey, coming through!" The word sounded foolish and small, swallowed almost immediately by the trees. Nothing answered. A few minutes later, a rock struck the trail 10 feet behind me. It came down hard, cracking against another stone, and I spun around with my heart already punching at my ribs. The rock was the size of a grapefruit, dark with lichen on one side, freshly broken on the other, and it rolled twice before settling in the mud. I looked up. The slope above me was steep, but not vertical, crowded with timber and deadfall, too thick to see more than 20 yards. "Bear," I whispered, though bears do not throw rocks. "Goat," I tried, though there were no goats in that timber. "Gravity," I said finally, because gravity asks no questions and answers many. I stood there for almost a minute with my bear spray in my hand, listening. Nothing moved. No branches swayed except in the wind. No animal huffed. No bird alarmed. That was the strangest part. The silence around the falling rock, as if the whole forest had witnessed it and decided not to get involved. By 3 o'clock, I reached the high meadow before Moraine Pass, where the valley opened for the first time in hours, and the world became enormous again. The meadow was full of late-season flowers and low willow, with the creek twisting silver through the middle, and the cliffs rising beyond it in red and gray towers. I felt relief so strongly I almost laughed. Open ground does that to you after too much dark timber. You can see. You can breathe. You can tell yourself that whatever you imagined under the trees has been left behind among the roots and shadows. I took out my phone for a picture, then remembered there was no service and used the satellite phone instead to check my position. It blinked awake, acquired signal, showed my route, showed the truck far behind me, showed the little triangular marker that was me standing in a world too large for electronics to truly understand. I was 29.7 kilometers from the trailhead by the route I had taken, less as the crow flies, more if weather or injury forced me around the creek crossings. I was tired, but not dangerously tired. My knees hurt, my shoulders ached, I could smell myself. Ordinary discomforts, human things, manageable things. Then I saw it. At first it was only a shape on the cliff, and because the human mind is merciful in the first second of terror, I thought it was a burned tree trunk or a shadow thrown by a notch in the rock. It stood on a ledge halfway up the cliff band across the meadow, maybe 400 yards away, maybe more. Distance becomes strange when fear stretches it. It was tall. That was the first truth I could not explain away. It was too tall to be a man and too upright to be a bear. Its shoulders were wide and sloped, its arms hung long, and its head seemed set low and forward as if it had no neck at all. The body was dark, not black exactly, but the color of wet bark, and it stood completely still while the wind moved around it. I raised one hand to shade my eyes. I remember that my fingers were trembling before I admitted to myself that they were trembling. The thing did not hide. It did not retreat. It watched me with the patience of something that had been watching people cross valleys long before people invented names for valleys. I do not know how long we remained like that. Me in the meadow with my pack cutting into my shoulders and the creek hissing behind me. It on the cliff with the gray sky moving above its head. Then, very slowly, it leaned forward. That was worse than if it had charged, worse than if it had roared. It leaned forward like a man trying to get a better look at something small on the ground. At me. I lifted the satellite phone, maybe to photograph it, maybe to call for help, maybe just because it was the only piece of the civilized world I had in my hand. The screen flickered. The signal bars vanished. For a second there was only the map, frozen under scratched glass, my little triangular marker alone in the meadow, and then the device went black. I pressed the power button. Nothing. I held it down. Nothing. I slapped the back like an idiot trying to fix a television from 1989. Nothing. When I looked back up, the ledge was empty. That was when the real fear began, not as a scream, not as panic, but as a cold intelligence moving through me, rearranging every fact I possessed. The truck was 30 kilometers away. The trail back passed through hours of timber where something had already moved beside me, something that could reach the cliff faster than I could cross the meadow, something that had watched me eat, watched me check my position, maybe watched me leave the truck. My satellite phone was dead. Clouds were thickening over the pass. I had maybe 5 hours of usable light and no desire whatsoever to spend the night in that valley. I looked at the empty ledge, then at the dark timber behind me, then at the thin trail leading back the way I had come. And somewhere deep in the forest below the cliff, something struck a tree 3 times with a sound like an axe hitting a coffin lid. The first instinct I had was to run, and I have replayed that moment in my head more times than I can count, because I have often wondered whether every decision that followed grew out of those few seconds, standing alone in that alpine meadow with my dead satellite phone in one hand and 30 kilometers of wilderness between me and my truck. Everything inside me screamed to run. My legs wanted it. My lungs wanted it. My imagination had already carried me halfway back to the trailhead. But another part of me, the slower, older part that had spent enough years in the Rockies to know how easily panic becomes its own predator, forced me to stand still. Men who run blindly through mountain trails break ankles in hidden holes, trip over roots slick with moss, tumble down embankments into rivers that look shallow until they carry you away. Fear has a way of convincing you that speed equals survival, but the mountains punish haste almost as often as they punish hesitation. I stood there listening to my own breathing echo inside my ears, while the meadow seemed impossibly bright around me. Every wildflower, every boulder, every patch of willow suddenly appearing unnaturally sharp, as though my mind had begun recording every detail because somewhere deep inside, it already knew that whatever happened next would divide my life into before and after. I looked back toward the cliff where I had seen the enormous figure standing only moments before. The ledge was empty. It wasn't simply that I could no longer see it. It was gone. There had been no movement, no scrambling over rocks, no dramatic leap into the trees below. 1 second something had been watching me from that impossible height, and the next, the cliff was as empty as though nothing had ever stood there at all. I found myself staring through my own binocular vision, desperately searching for a shape, a shadow, some rational explanation that would shrink what I had seen into the size of a mistake. Perhaps it had been a burned tree after all. Perhaps shifting clouds had created an illusion. Perhaps exhaustion had played tricks on me. Human beings are remarkably talented at negotiating with reality when reality becomes too frightening to accept. I was still bargaining with myself when the first sound reached me. 3 heavy knocks rolled through the valley. Not close, not distant enough to ignore. Just close enough that I felt them before I truly heard them. Each impact echoed against the surrounding cliffs with a deep wooden resonance, unlike anything I had ever encountered. It reminded me of someone striking the trunk of a massive tree with another log rather than an axe. Slow, deliberate blows separated by identical pauses. There was rhythm to it, almost language. I waited for another hiker to answer, for laughter, for voices carrying through the mountain air, for any ordinary explanation that would place another human somewhere nearby. Nothing answered. The valley simply absorbed the sound and became quiet again. I realized then that standing in the middle of the meadow suddenly felt like standing on a stage. The open ground that had seemed comforting only minutes earlier now offered nowhere to hide, nowhere to disappear, nowhere to become invisible. If whatever I had seen had chosen that meadow because it offered an uninterrupted view in every direction, then it also meant I had been visible for hundreds of meters without realizing it. The thought settled over me with surprising weight. I wasn't simply alone anymore. I had been observed. I slipped the useless satellite phone back into its pouch, tightened the straps of my backpack until they dug painfully into my shoulders, and turned toward the trail leading back the way I had come. Every instinct urged me to hurry, but I refused to run. Instead, I walked with the fastest controlled pace I could manage, convincing myself that if I simply kept moving, I would eventually laugh about this from the comfort of my truck. The first few hundred meters passed without incident. The trail dipped back beneath the timber, and the enormous openness of the meadow disappeared behind dense walls of spruce and fir. Within moments, the daylight dimmed noticeably, not because evening had arrived, but because the forest admitted only scattered fragments of sunlight through its tightly woven canopy. The air grew cooler. Damp earth replaced the smell of alpine flowers. The cheerful murmur of the creek became muffled somewhere below the slope until it sounded less like running water and more like someone whispering continuously behind a closed door. It took several minutes before I realized something was wrong with the forest itself. At first, I couldn't identify it. Everything appeared normal enough. Trees, moss, fallen logs, ferns. Yet the longer I walked, the more uneasy I became. Finally, the answer arrived all at once. There were no birds. Not a single call echoed through the trees. No squirrels chattered overhead. Even the insects seemed to have vanished. The silence wasn't empty. It was occupied. It felt as though the entire forest had paused in expectation of something neither I nor any other visitor was supposed to witness. I stopped walking without consciously deciding to, and for perhaps 20 seconds I stood absolutely motionless, listening so hard that my own heartbeat seemed loud enough to attract attention. The woods remained perfectly still. Then somewhere uphill came the unmistakable sound of a footstep. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Something had pressed its full body onto the forest floor with complete confidence. There followed a long pause, then another step, each one measured and patient. I turned toward the slope, my eyes searching between dark tree trunks rising toward the ridge above me. But I saw nothing beyond shifting shadows and dense undergrowth. My hand had already found the bear spray hanging from my belt before I consciously realized I had reached for it. The bright orange canister suddenly looked almost ridiculous. It had always represented reassurance, something practical and dependable that separated preparation from recklessness. Now it seemed absurdly small against whatever my imagination had begun constructing among those trees. The footsteps stopped. I waited. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. Finally, I allowed myself to breathe again, and quietly told myself that it had probably been an elk or a moose moving through the timber above the trail. Large animals sound surprisingly human in thick forest. I had explained away enough strange noises over the years to know that was true. The branch snapped directly behind me. I spun around so violently that my backpack swung sideways, nearly throwing me off balance. Nothing stood on the trail. Nothing emerged from behind the trees. Only silent forest stretched in every direction, yet the branch lying freshly broken across the moss had not broken itself. I stared at it until my eyes watered. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice sounding strangely small beneath the towering spruce. The words rushed away through the trees and disappeared without receiving so much as an echo. The silence that followed somehow felt heavier than before, as though the forest had listened to my question and chosen not to answer. I resumed walking, this time considerably faster, and eventually reached a small spring crossing where water seeped across the trail before disappearing downhill beneath a carpet of moss. The mud preserved tracks beautifully, and I immediately recognized the prints my own boots had left several hours earlier while heading deeper into the valley. Seeing them brought an unexpected surge of comfort, proof that I had already survived this stretch once today, proof that home still existed somewhere beyond the trees behind me. Then I noticed another set of impressions crossing directly over mine, and every comforting thought dissolved almost instantly. I crouched slowly, trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I saw. The tracks were barefoot. 5 distinct toes spread naturally into the mud. There were no claw marks, no boot tread, no signs of shoes. The heel sank deeply, suggesting tremendous weight, and each footprint measured nearly twice the length of my own hiking boot. More disturbing still, the edges remained crisp. Water had not yet begun softening them. They were fresh. I followed them with my eyes. They emerged from dense forest on the uphill side of the trail, crossed directly over the prints I had made that morning, and disappeared into equally dense timber below. They had not followed the trail. They had crossed it, intercepted it. The realization arrived with sickening clarity. Those tracks had not been there when I walked north. I would have noticed them. They had appeared afterward, while I had been standing in the meadow staring at the figure on the cliff. Whatever I had seen had somehow descended hundreds of meters of broken mountainside, reached the trail ahead of me, crossed exactly where I would later have to return, and vanished back into the forest before I ever started walking. I suddenly found myself calculating impossible distances, impossible speeds, impossible strength, but every calculation ended the same way. It should not have been able to do that. As I slowly stood, another sound drifted through the trees, so soft at first that I almost mistook it for wind moving between branches. It was a whistle. 3 descending notes, clear and deliberate, unmistakably produced by lungs rather than breeze. There was something almost casual about it, the kind of whistle a man might use while waiting for a friend to catch up along a trail. Except it came from somewhere ahead of me. Directly ahead. Somewhere between me and the truck. I remained frozen, every muscle refusing to move while the final note faded into the forest. Several long seconds passed before another sound answered it. Far behind me, somewhere back toward the meadow, 3 slow knocks echoed once more against a distant tree. The 2 sounds seemed connected somehow, not by distance but by intention, like signals exchanged across a valley by hunters who already knew exactly where their quarry was standing. For the first time since entering the Rockies that morning, a thought entered my mind that I could neither dismiss nor rationalize away. The thing I had seen on the cliff might not have been alone. And if it wasn't alone, then I was no longer trying to outrun one impossible creature. I was somewhere inside the territory of something that hunted as though it already knew every trail, every shortcut, every escape route, including mine. I wish I could tell you that I remained calm after hearing those answering signals drift across the valley, that I paused to think things through the way survival experts always recommend, carefully weighing my options before committing to a course of action, but that would be a lie polished smooth by hindsight. The truth is that something primitive took hold of me in those moments, something buried far beneath reason and pride and modern confidence, something older than language itself. Every instinct I possessed reached the same terrible conclusion before my conscious mind was willing to admit it. I was being hunted. Not followed out of curiosity, not watched from a safe distance. Hunted. There is a profound difference between believing you are alone in the wilderness and realizing the wilderness has known exactly where you are for hours. The mountains did not suddenly seem larger than before. They seemed occupied. Every ridge became a place where eyes could wait. Every stand of spruce became a curtain behind which something infinitely patient could remain perfectly still until the precise moment it chose to move. I forced myself onward because standing still had become impossible. The trail descended through increasingly dense timber where fallen trees lay across the path like barricades, forcing me to climb over slick trunks or crawl beneath tangled branches that snagged my pack and tore at my sleeves. My breathing had become loud enough that I hated it. Every exhale sounded like an announcement of my position, every snapped twig beneath my boots an invitation. More than once I caught myself holding my breath while stepping over deadfall, absurdly believing silence might somehow erase me from whatever intelligence occupied the forest around me. Yet the woods remained unnervingly still. No birds returned. No squirrels resumed their frantic arguments overhead. Even the wind seemed unwilling to disturb the branches. It felt less like walking through a forest than walking through a cathedral whose congregation had quietly risen to watch a stranger approach the altar. After perhaps 20 minutes, I reached an old avalanche chute where the trees gave way to a broad scar of shattered rock, broken timber, and young saplings struggling to reclaim the mountainside. The openness should have been comforting. Instead, it exposed me. I crossed quickly, glancing repeatedly toward the steep slopes rising on both sides. Halfway across, I noticed movement high above me. It was only a flicker at first, so brief I questioned whether I had imagined it. But then I saw it again. Something dark passed between two stunted spruce near the ridgeline, disappearing almost immediately behind a cluster of boulders. It moved with astonishing speed, yet without apparent effort, covering broken terrain that would have taken me several exhausting minutes to negotiate. I stopped walking and stared until my eyes watered, hoping desperately for another glimpse that would reveal it to be a black bear or perhaps a wandering elk silhouetted awkwardly against the sky. Nothing reappeared. The ridge remained empty. Yet the certainty settled over me with cold precision. Whatever I had seen on the cliff no longer needed the trail. It was simply keeping pace above me. The realization changed everything. Until then, I had still believed I possessed choices. I could stop. I could continue. I could camp early if darkness overtook me. I could alter my route. But if something could travel freely through terrain where I struggled simply to remain upright, then every decision I made existed only because it allowed me to believe I was still making decisions. It could see farther than I could, move faster than I could, reach places I could not. The trail, which had always felt like my guide back toward safety, suddenly resembled a corridor someone else had selected long before I ever arrived. Clouds continued gathering overhead, swallowing the afternoon sun until the light took on that strange gray quality unique to the Rockies before a storm. The temperature dropped noticeably. I pulled on a light shell without stopping, my fingers clumsy now from adrenaline rather than cold. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled once behind the peaks, deep enough that I felt it through the soles of my boots. Rain I could handle, wind I could handle. Even an early snowfall would simply become another problem to solve. What terrified me was the possibility that weather would erase tracks, shorten visibility, and cover whatever sounds might warn me that I was no longer alone. I rounded a bend where the trail narrowed beside Moraine Creek, the river pressing hard against a wall of rock on one side while dense timber crowded close on the other. There was barely enough room to walk single file. The creek itself had become louder since morning, swollen by snowmelt somewhere higher in the mountains, its white water smashing against boulders with enough force to drown almost every other sound. I remember feeling a brief surge of relief because surely nothing could move quietly through all that noise. Then a stone landed in the creek barely 20 feet ahead of me. It struck with such force that water exploded several meters into the air. I froze. The rock had not rolled down the slope. It had entered almost vertically. I slowly looked upward toward the trees clinging to the hillside. Nothing. Before I could move, another stone crashed into the water farther downstream. Then another behind me, not random, not natural. 3 separate impacts, 3 deliberate throws, one ahead, one behind, one beside me. The realization arrived before the fear did. Someone, or something, was walking me through that narrow section of trail exactly the way a sheepdog moves livestock through a gate. I abandoned any hope of appearing calm and began moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. My boots slipped repeatedly on wet stones while branches whipped across my face. I no longer cared how much noise I made. The forest knew where I was. It probably always had. Every few seconds I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that enormous figure striding openly down the trail behind me. Instead, I saw only empty forest, and somehow that frightened me more. Predators, you can see, at least occupy a known place in the world. The unseen ones exist everywhere at once. Several hundred meters later, the trail climbed sharply away from the creek toward a narrow ridge covered in thick lodgepole pine. My legs burned from the ascent, my pulse hammering against my temples, sweat running cold beneath my backpack despite the dropping temperature. I had almost reached the crest when I heard the breathing. It wasn't mine. Mine was ragged and desperate. This breathing was slow, controlled, deep. It came from somewhere just beyond the trees to my left. One inhale, one long exhale. Then silence. I stopped instantly. The breathing stopped with me. For several endless seconds, neither of us moved. Then, very deliberately, I heard one heavy footstep crunch into the forest floor, not toward me, parallel, matching my position. I began walking again, one step, The unseen thing matched me. I stopped. It stopped. I took 3 quick steps. 3 answering footfalls came through the timber, never closer, never farther, simply remaining alongside me. The intelligence of it struck me harder than the fear. Bears don't pace hikers. Cougars don't announce themselves. Wolves observe from concealment until opportunity presents itself. Whatever walked beyond those trees wanted me to understand that it was there. It wanted me measuring the distance between us. It wanted every step home to become an exercise in imagination. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the breathing ceased. The footsteps vanished. The forest became silent once more. I remained standing on that ridge for what felt like several minutes before convincing myself to continue. Perhaps it had lost interest. Perhaps I had finally reached the edge of its territory. Perhaps I had frightened myself into hearing patterns where none existed. Hope is a remarkably persistent companion, even when every piece of evidence argues against it. The illusion lasted less than 5 minutes. Ahead, where the trail curved around a massive glacial boulder, stood a cedar tree unlike the others surrounding it. Its trunk measured nearly 2 meters across, ancient even by mountain standards, its bark deeply furrowed and dark with age. I might have walked straight past it had something pale not caught my eye against the rough brown bark. At first I assumed someone had nailed an old trail marker to the tree decades earlier. Then I moved closer. There were no nails, no paint, no marker. Only 5 enormous gouges cut deeply into the trunk. Each groove was perfectly parallel. Each extended nearly a meter downward. Fresh wood gleamed beneath the shredded bark, still damp with sap. I reached out almost without thinking and placed my hand beside one of the marks. My fingers disappeared inside it. Whatever had carved those grooves had done so recently. The sap still smelled sweet. The wood still bled. Something powerful enough to rake living cedar like soft butter had stood exactly where I was standing now. As I slowly backed away from the tree, another knock echoed somewhere deep ahead on the trail. Only one this time, not 3. Just one. As though whoever or whatever had made it no longer needed to communicate with anything else. It already knew exactly where I was going, and it intended to meet me there. I have often wondered whether fear changes the way time passes or whether it simply changes the way memory stores it, because the next several hours remain strangely vivid to me in isolated fragments, while everything between those fragments seems to have dissolved into a blur of pounding footsteps, shallow breathing, and constant glances over my shoulder. I remember the smell of wet cedar after the first drops of rain began falling through the canopy. I remember the sharp sting of a spruce branch scraping across my cheek hard enough to draw blood. I remember my own heartbeat becoming so relentless that I eventually stopped noticing it altogether, as though my body had decided it could no longer afford to report every emergency individually. Mostly, though, I remember trying to convince myself that there had to be an explanation for the marks on that cedar tree. Some logging equipment decades earlier, lightning, rockfall, anything except the obvious conclusion waiting patiently in the back of my mind. The grooves had been too clean, too evenly spaced, too fresh. The sap had still been running down the bark like slow tears. Whatever had left those marks had wanted them to be found. They were not scratches. They were a message. Whether the message had been meant for me or whether I had simply wandered into someone else's territory and happened to read it, I could not say. But from that moment onward, I no longer felt like I was walking through wilderness. I felt like I was moving through a place that belonged to something else entirely. The rain strengthened quickly, beginning as a gentle hiss against the needles high above before settling into a steady cold drizzle that soaked through the shoulders of my jacket and turned every exposed root into polished glass. Normally, rain in the Rockies is an inconvenience, sometimes even a comfort, because it cools the air and keeps the dust down on long hikes. That afternoon it became another enemy. Every minute it washed away evidence I might have used to understand where the thing had gone. Fresh tracks softened almost immediately. The forest darkened beneath thickening clouds until it felt much later than it actually was. More importantly, the sound of falling rain blended with the rustling branches and rushing creek until every small noise became impossible to identify. Several times I spun toward what I thought were approaching footsteps, only to discover nothing more than water dripping heavily from overloaded branches. A few moments later I ignored another sound, convincing myself it was only rain, until a fist-sized rock struck a tree somewhere behind me with such force that the impact echoed through the valley. I never saw where the rock came from. I simply increased my pace and resisted every urge to look back. My map told me I was approaching an old suspension bridge crossing Moraine Creek, one of those narrow Parks Canada structures built decades ago from steel cables and weathered wooden planks. I remembered crossing it earlier that morning without giving it a second thought. At the time, it had simply been another landmark along an enjoyable day hike. Now it represented something much more important. Once across, the trail climbed onto a broad bench where visibility improved considerably before descending toward the lower valley. If I could just reach the bridge, I told myself, I would finally have some open country again. I clung to that thought with surprising desperation. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to attach hope to geography. We imagine safety waiting just beyond the next ridge, the next bend, the next river crossing. It keeps us moving when logic suggests we should already have stopped. The first indication that something was wrong came before I actually saw the bridge. The sound of the creek had changed. Earlier it had been loud but steady, the constant roar of snowmelt pushing between rocks. Now another sound mixed with it, irregular and metallic, as though steel were shifting under strain. At first I assumed increasing runoff had begun throwing driftwood against the bridge supports. Then I rounded the final corner and stopped so abruptly that my boots slid several inches through the mud. The bridge hung exactly where it should have been, stretching perhaps 40 meters across the gorge, but something about it immediately felt wrong. One side swayed gently despite almost no wind. Several of the wooden planks near the middle had been ripped completely free, leaving dark gaps where white water churned 20 meters below. More disturbing still, one of the steel hand cables sagged noticeably lower than the other, as though something immensely heavy had climbed onto it or pulled against it with tremendous force. I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing while rain drummed steadily against my hood. Suspension bridges move, they creak, they settle. That was normal. But this bridge looked injured. I approached cautiously until I reached the entrance. One of the first planks bore a fresh footprint filled with rainwater. I knelt instinctively. It was far too large to be mine. The print wasn't perfectly preserved because the wet wood had not held every detail, yet the shape remained unmistakable, bare, long, wide across the forefoot. The rain had not yet washed it away completely, meaning it could only have been made recently. My stomach tightened as another realization slowly settled over me. Whatever had crossed this bridge had done so after I went north that morning. It had crossed toward me. I found myself looking automatically to the opposite side of the creek. Dense forest climbed the far slope in overlapping walls of spruce and fir, interrupted only occasionally by massive boulders deposited there thousands of years earlier by retreating glaciers. Nothing moved. Nothing revealed itself. Yet I could not escape the overwhelming certainty that if I stared long enough, eventually I would notice a pair of eyes already staring back. Instead, I looked down into the gorge. The creek had swollen dramatically since morning, foaming around black rocks with terrifying violence. There was no possibility of fording it. A fall into that water would almost certainly become a recovery operation rather than a rescue. The bridge was no longer simply the easiest option. It was the only option. I tightened the waist belt on my backpack, pulled the bear spray into my hand, and stepped onto the first plank. The bridge responded immediately with a slow rolling movement that traveled from one end to the other. Steel cables groaned softly overhead. Wet boards shifted beneath my boots. I kept my eyes fixed on the far side and concentrated on placing one careful step after another. 20 meters below, the creek surged through the narrow gorge with enough force to make the entire structure seem fragile by comparison. About a third of the way across, I reached the first missing plank. The gap measured perhaps half a meter, easily crossed under ordinary circumstances. Yet with the bridge swaying beneath me and white water rushing below, it suddenly appeared much larger. I stepped over it carefully, gripping the cable with one hand while balancing against the bridge's slow movement. My breathing sounded unnaturally loud inside my hood. Then the bridge moved. Not swayed. Moved. A violent jolt surged through the cables from behind me, throwing me forward hard enough that my knees slammed into the wet planks. Before I could even process what had happened, another tremendous vibration ran through the structure. The steel cables sang with tension. The entire bridge bounced beneath me as though something of extraordinary weight had just stepped onto it. I scrambled upright and turned. The entrance stood empty. Rain fell steadily across the clearing. The trail behind me disappeared into dripping timber. There was no one there. The bridge lurched again. This time I saw the movement begin. The far end of the entrance cables flexed downward under a tremendous load. Not enough to reveal whatever stood upon them, only enough to prove something heavy had just committed its weight to the bridge. I stared in disbelief. The planks behind me began creaking one after another. Not randomly, sequentially, one, then the next, then another, exactly as though invisible footsteps were advancing steadily toward me. The spacing between the sounds was wrong for any man. Too far apart, too deliberate. The bridge dipped again. Another plank groaned, closer now. I found myself backing away instinctively, never taking my eyes off the empty entrance. Every instinct screamed at me that there had to be something visible, something my terrified mind had somehow overlooked, but the rain continued falling through perfectly empty air, while the bridge behaved as though an enormous, unseen traveler had begun crossing behind me. I backed faster. The bridge swayed harder. Another gap in the planks forced me to leap awkwardly, nearly losing my footing as my boots landed on slick wood. Behind me, the creaking continued at exactly the same steady rhythm, one impossible footstep after another, closing the distance without hurry. Halfway across, I made the mistake of looking down. The creek exploded upward beside me. A boulder the size of a microwave crashed into the torrent scarcely 3 meters from the bridge, throwing freezing spray across my face and knocking the entire structure violently sideways. That rock had not fallen naturally. It entered the water almost vertically, as though dropped from directly above, yet there were no cliffs overhanging the gorge. Only forest. I ran. Reason disappeared completely. Every survival lesson I had ever learned dissolved beneath pure instinct. The bridge bucked wildly beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the opposite bank, slipping repeatedly on rain-soaked planks while the cables shrieked overhead. Somewhere behind me, another tremendous impact shook the structure so violently that I actually felt one of the hand cables vibrate against my shoulder. I never looked back again. I reached the far side almost out of control, threw myself onto solid ground, stumbled several steps through mud, and finally collapsed behind a massive boulder with my lungs burning and my entire body shaking so violently I could barely hold on to the bear spray. For several long moments I could do nothing except listen. Rain, the creek, my own breathing. Then from somewhere out over the bridge came a single slow creak, followed by another. Then silence. I forced myself to peer cautiously around the edge of the boulder. The bridge hung motionless over the gorge, empty, completely empty. No figure stood upon it, no bear, no hiker, nothing. Only 40 meters of wet wooden planks swaying gently above white water. Then very slowly, one plank near the exact middle of the bridge lifted several centimeters, as though something immense had just stepped off it. The plank settled back into place. And somewhere deep in the forest behind me on the side I had just escaped to, something answered with 3 slow knocks against a tree. It hadn't crossed the bridge. It hadn't needed to. I had always believed that darkness arrived because the sun went down. But somewhere beyond that suspension bridge, I learned there was another kind of darkness altogether. One that could settle over a forest in the middle of the afternoon simply because your mind had begun imagining what might already be standing between the trees. I remained crouched behind that enormous boulder for several minutes, my breathing slowly returning to something resembling normal, while cold rainwater dripped steadily from my hood onto my knees. Every instinct told me not to move. If the thing had somehow reached my side of the creek without crossing the bridge, then the rules by which I had been judging distance, terrain, and time were no longer useful. I unfolded my map with trembling hands and immediately regretted doing so. The paper had become damp despite the waterproof sleeve, and my finger left small muddy streaks as I traced the route back toward the trailhead. I had covered roughly 12 kilometers since leaving the meadow. 18 remained. Under ordinary conditions, that represented 5 or 6 comfortable hours of hiking. Under the conditions I now faced, with rain, failing light, and something using the mountains as though they were its own front yard, those 18 kilometers might as well have been 1,800. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to think the thought I had stubbornly refused to entertain. I might not make it back. That realization should have filled me with panic, yet instead it brought a strange and terrible clarity. Up until then, I had still been arguing with reality, trying to convince myself there must be an explanation hidden somewhere just beyond my understanding. Perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank. Perhaps I had stumbled into a clandestine research project, or an illegal grow operation whose occupants were attempting to frighten me away. Every new piece of evidence had chipped away at those comforting lies, until nothing remained. Rocks did not throw themselves with deliberate accuracy. Footprints did not appear where no human could have reached in time. Bridges did not behave as though invisible freight trains were crossing them. The mountains were no longer asking me to explain what was happening. They were demanding that I survive it. The rain finally began easing, leaving behind a cold mist that drifted silently between the trees and transformed the forest into layer upon layer of pale gray curtains. Visibility dropped to perhaps 30 meters in any direction. The trunks nearest me stood sharp and dark, but beyond them every shape dissolved into shifting fog where imagination eagerly supplied details my eyes could not confirm. Several times I thought I saw broad shoulders slipping behind distant spruce, only to realize they were broken stumps leaning at awkward angles. Once I became absolutely certain I was looking directly at a massive figure standing beside the trail, until a gust of wind separated the mist and revealed nothing more threatening than an uprooted root ball. Fear had begun editing reality before it reached my conscious mind, and I understood that if I allowed it to take complete control, I would soon be unable to distinguish genuine danger from my own imagination. I forced myself to concentrate on practical tasks: drink water, check compass, tighten boot laces, count paces between landmarks, keep moving. Civilization, I discovered, is largely a collection of small routines that prevent panic from taking command. The trail descended gradually into older forest where the spruce grew so large that several people joining hands could barely have encircled a single trunk. Moss blanketed everything. Fallen logs had softened into green mounds over decades of slow decay, and curtains of pale lichen hung from branches like ancient beards. It was beautiful in a way I had never fully appreciated before, but beauty under those circumstances had become deeply unsettling. Nothing looked dead. Everything looked ancient. The forest gave the impression that it had been patiently watching generations of hikers come and go without changing itself in the slightest. I began noticing details I would normally have ignored. High on one trunk I found another series of parallel gouges, older this time, nearly grown over by decades of new bark. Farther along stood a second tree carrying similar scars, then another, some weathered almost smooth with age, others fresher. None appeared random. It slowly dawned on me that the mountains might have been carrying these marks for hundreds of years, while generations of hikers passed beneath them without ever wondering who had written them there. The first smell reached me long before I heard anything. It drifted through the damp air unexpectedly, cutting through the rich scent of wet earth and spruce with startling strength. At first I thought something large had died nearby. There was a sourness to it, mixed with damp animal fur and the unmistakable odor of something that had spent a long time living outdoors, without ever becoming familiar with soap, smoke, gasoline, or any of the countless smells human beings carry into wilderness without realizing it. It wasn't simply unpleasant. It felt wild in the deepest sense of the word, as though the smell itself belonged to an older version of the world. The wind shifted again, and the odor disappeared almost instantly. I stood perfectly still, listening. Nothing. Only the slow dripping of water from branches overhead. I started walking again, and after perhaps 20 steps, the smell returned. Stronger now, lingering only long enough to make every muscle across my shoulders tighten before vanishing once more. Whatever produced it was moving with the breeze. never remaining in one place long enough for me to locate it. The trail rounded another bend and entered a small clearing where lightning had toppled several enormous trees years earlier. In the middle of the clearing stood what remained of an old Parks Canada emergency shelter, little more than a weathered log structure with half its roof collapsed beneath winter snow sometime in the past. I remembered seeing it that morning and barely giving it a glance. Now it looked almost welcoming despite its obvious decay. 4 walls still stood. Part of the roof remained intact. More importantly, it represented something built by human hands. I approached cautiously, stepping over rotting logs and waist-high fireweed until I reached the open doorway. Inside lay little more than dirt, broken timbers, and the remains of a rusted wood stove whose chimney had long since fallen through the roof. Someone had carved initials into one wall decades earlier. Another hiker had scratched the date 1997 beside them. I actually smiled for the first time all day. It was astonishing how comforting evidence of ordinary people could become. The smile disappeared almost immediately. In the layer of damp earth covering the shelter floor were footprints, not old, fresh, bare. They entered through the doorway, crossed the entire interior, stopped directly in front of the broken stove, then turned and walked back out. Nothing else, no boot prints, no signs anyone had camped there. Just one set of enormous barefoot tracks wandering into an abandoned shelter for reasons I could not begin to imagine before leaving again exactly the way they had entered. I backed slowly out of the doorway, every instinct warning me not to turn my back on the dark interior until I had reached the edge of the clearing. The smell returned almost immediately, stronger than before. This time it carried another scent beneath it. Wet cedar, freshly broken wood. My eyes drifted toward the tree line beyond the shelter. A young spruce was swaying, not with the wind. Everything else remained perfectly still. Only that one tree moved. It bent sideways, paused, then slowly returned upright. I stared at it without blinking. Nothing happened for perhaps 10 seconds. Then the spruce bent again, farther this time, as though something enormous standing behind it had rested one hand against the trunk. I never actually saw the hand, only the movement. The tree straightened once more. Silence returned. My heart pounded so violently that I could feel my pulse inside my ears. Then, from somewhere deep behind that motionless wall of trees, came a sound unlike any I had ever heard before. It began as a low rumble, not quite a growl, not quite a voice. The sound climbed steadily in pitch until it became an impossibly deep, resonant howl that rolled through the entire valley like the horn of some prehistoric ship emerging from dense fog. The vibration seemed to pass through the ground itself. I felt it in my boots. Birds exploded from distant trees all at once, hundreds of them taking flight in complete panic. Somewhere farther down the valley, another howl answered, lower and shorter but unmistakably similar. My blood turned to ice. The first had not been calling into empty wilderness. It had been announcing my position. The second had replied. For one frozen moment I stood in the clearing between those two voices, suddenly understanding why every encounter so far had unfolded with such impossible precision. The rocks, the whistles, the knocks, the footprints crossing my trail, the bridge. None of it had been random intimidation. They had been moving me, keeping me exactly where they wanted me, and judging by the direction of those two calls, they had just finished surrounding me. I did not wait to hear another call. The second howl had barely finished echoing through the valley before I was moving again, leaving the ruined shelter behind with the desperate determination of a man who has finally accepted that every comforting assumption he has been carrying all day has quietly died somewhere along the trail. There are moments when the human mind simply refuses to absorb any additional fear because it has already exceeded its own capacity. I had reached that point. The panic was still there, buried beneath my ribs like an animal trying to claw its way out, but above it another emotion had begun taking control. It was colder, more practical. Every decision I made from that point onward came from a single objective that drowned out every other concern. Reach the truck. Nothing else mattered. Food no longer mattered. Fatigue no longer mattered. Pride certainly no longer mattered. If someone had told me I would have to crawl the remaining kilometers on my hands and knees through freezing mud to reach that parking lot, I would have accepted the bargain without hesitation. The trail continued descending through increasingly dense forest, but I noticed something that made my stomach tighten all over again. The path itself had become easier to follow. Earlier in the day, it had wandered naturally around fallen trees, climbed over exposed roots, and twisted between boulders the way old mountain trails always do. Now it seemed unusually clear. Dead branches had somehow disappeared from the tread. Freshly broken limbs lay off to either side as though someone had recently pushed them away. At first I welcomed the improvement, grateful that at least one part of my journey had become less difficult. Then another thought quietly entered my mind, and once it arrived I could not force it back out. I bent down beside one of the broken branches. The exposed wood was pale and damp with fresh sap. It had snapped recently, very recently. I looked farther ahead. Another broken branch, then another. Not random storm damage, not windfall. They formed a subtle corridor through the timber. It looked less like a hiking trail than something that had been cleared. I stood there longer than I should have, staring down that narrow ribbon disappearing into the trees. Every instinct urged me to keep following it because it remained the fastest route back to the truck. Yet every encounter since the meadow had shared one disturbing pattern. I had always been exactly where something wanted me to be. The whistles had directed me. The rocks had hurried me. Even the suspension bridge had become a bottleneck from which there had been no alternative. The possibility settled over me with frightening clarity. What if the trail itself had become the trap? I stepped off it. The decision lasted less than 2 seconds, but changed everything that followed. I pushed through shoulder-high huckleberry bushes into untouched forest where no obvious path existed, weaving carefully between thick spruce trunks while trying to maintain roughly the same direction using my compass. Within moments, the difference became obvious. Progress slowed dramatically. Fallen logs blocked every few meters. Moss-covered rocks rolled beneath my boots. Low branches clawed constantly at my jacket and backpack. It was exhausting, frustrating. Yet something deep inside me relaxed ever so slightly. For the first time since leaving the meadow, I was no longer walking exactly where someone, or something, expected me to walk. The relief lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Then I heard movement, not behind me, ahead. It wasn't loud, just the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps forcing their way through dense timber. I froze instantly. So did the footsteps. We remained motionless together, separated by perhaps 50 meters of forest I could not see through. I crouched slowly beside the root ball of an overturned spruce, scarcely daring to breathe. The rain had finally stopped, leaving only water dripping from branches overhead, each drop sounding unnaturally loud against the silence. 1 full minute passed, then another. I began wondering whether I had imagined the sound after all. A dead tree cracked. Not the sharp report of a branch snapping, the slow, groaning fracture of an entire trunk giving way under tremendous force. The sound echoed through the forest, followed by a heavy crash that shook the ground beneath my boots. Then silence. Complete silence. Whatever had broken that tree had done so deliberately.
Not to reach me.
To let me know it could. I remained hidden behind the uprooted tree for what felt like forever, before finally gathering enough courage to continue. Every step now demanded concentration. My eyes never stopped searching between the trunks. Several times I found myself staring at shadows that looked unnervingly like broad shoulders until they resolved into weathered stumps or leaning rocks. Fear had become an artist, constantly painting monsters onto the landscape before reluctantly admitting they were trees. I knew the danger of allowing imagination to outrun evidence, yet evidence kept arriving often enough that imagination hardly needed to work anymore. Perhaps half an hour later, I climbed onto a low ridge where the forest briefly opened, allowing me to see through gaps in the trees toward the valley below. I stopped immediately. The hiking trail lay perhaps 200 meters away. I had unintentionally looped back toward it. That alone would not have disturbed me. What froze me where I stood was the movement upon it. Something crossed the trail, not quickly, not furtively. It simply walked from one side of the forest to the other with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had never once doubted its place in the mountains. I saw only part of it. A dark shape moving between tree trunks, a shoulder, an arm impossibly long compared to any man's, the top of a head passing briefly through an opening before disappearing again behind the timber. It never looked toward me. At least I don't think it did. The entire sighting lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Yet those 3 seconds erased every remaining doubt that I had spent the afternoon chasing ghosts. It existed. It was real. And it was considerably larger than I had first believed. My first irrational thought was relief, not because I had seen it, because it had not seen me. Then another realization struck with almost physical force. How could I possibly know that? The creature had crossed the trail without haste, without caution, without searching. As though it already possessed all the information it required. The idea that it might have known exactly where I was while pretending not to notice me proved somehow even more terrifying than if it had charged directly toward me. I retreated carefully from the ridge and continued weaving through untouched forest until the terrain steepened dramatically. Granite outcrops forced me lower toward a narrow drainage choked with alder and willow. Progress became miserable. Branches whipped across my face. My boots sank repeatedly into hidden pools beneath thick moss. Several times I had to remove my backpack entirely just to squeeze between fallen logs. My watch told me nearly 2 hours had passed since leaving the ruined shelter. Darkness would arrive sooner beneath the trees than on open ground. I hated the thought of being forced to spend a night out here, but another problem had begun overshadowing even that fear. I was losing my sense of direction, not completely. The compass still worked, but the countless detours around cliffs, bogs, and deadfall had slowly carried me farther from the trail than I intended. I stopped repeatedly to confirm my bearings, each pause costing precious minutes while daylight faded beneath gathering clouds. Somewhere ahead the creek roared again, though whether it was the same crossing I remembered from earlier or an entirely different branch of the drainage I could no longer say with confidence. That uncertainty gnawed at me more than I expected. Predators are frightening. Being lost while something hunts you is something else entirely. I had just decided to fight my way downhill toward the water when I noticed the ravens. There were 6 of them, large, coal-black. They perched silently in the upper branches of dead spruce overlooking the drainage. None called, none flew away. Every one of them faced exactly the same direction, not toward me, beyond me. I slowly turned. The forest behind me appeared empty. Then one raven spread its wings. Another followed. Within seconds, all 6 lifted into the air without making a sound, circling once above the trees before gliding deeper into the valley. My eyes followed them automatically. That was when I saw it. Far away, perhaps 150 meters through the timber. Something pale moved between the trunks. Not white, gray, the color of old weathered bark. It disappeared almost immediately, then appeared again farther to the left, not walking, circling, trying to remain hidden while keeping pace. I stared until my eyes watered. Nothing. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a massive spruce tree began to sway. There was no wind, no storm, only that one tree moving. Then the tree beside it, then another. Something enormous was passing through the forest, coming directly toward the drainage, coming directly toward me, and for the first time all day, I realized with sickening certainty that whatever had been following me no longer cared whether I knew it was there. It was done hiding. By then I had stopped thinking in hours and kilometers. My world had shrunk to the next 100 meters of forest, the next sound, the next decision that might keep me alive for another few minutes. People often imagine that terror sharpens the mind, that under extreme pressure everything becomes clearer. But that wasn't my experience at all. Terror narrows the mind until it can barely hold on to one thought at a time. My entire existence became a sequence of simple commands. Move, listen, stop, breathe, look, move again. The future had become too large to consider. Even the truck sitting patiently in the trailhead parking lot with its dry seats, its heater, its keys still in the ignition compartment where I always left the spare, felt less like a destination than a memory from somebody else's life. I could barely remember what it had felt like that morning to lace up my boots without first wondering whether something was already watching from the trees. The drainage I had been following grew steeper until it emptied into a river far larger than Moraine Creek. I recognized it only after several long moments of confusion. It was the same river I had crossed that morning on a narrow gravel bar several kilometers downstream from the suspension bridge. Overnight snowmelt from higher elevations had transformed it. What had been knee-deep water flowing calmly around polished stones had become a broad, violent torrent, the color of cold steel, carrying entire tree trunks downstream with frightening speed. The current hammered against the banks hard enough to tear away chunks of earth, exposing tangled roots that hung into the water like skeletal fingers. My carefully planned return route was gone. The gravel crossing had vanished beneath churning whitewater. I walked nearly 200 meters upstream, searching desperately for another place to cross, but every bend revealed the same impossible sight. Fast water, deep water, no bridge, no fallen trees, nothing that resembled hope. I stood on the bank trying to think while the roar of the river drowned every other sound in the valley. Part of me considered following the river downstream in search of another crossing, but I knew that could cost hours I no longer possessed. Another part considered building a shelter before darkness arrived. Yet the thought of remaining stationary until morning filled me with almost physical revulsion. Whatever inhabited these mountains had demonstrated remarkable patience throughout the day. Giving it an entire night to work with seemed less like survival than surrender. I found myself studying the river the way a gambler studies impossible odds, searching for some tiny imperfection that might improve my chances. About 50 meters upstream, a large spruce had fallen partway across the current years earlier. Most of its branches had long since broken away, leaving only the thick trunk extending over perhaps 2/3 of the river before disappearing into foaming water. It did not reach the opposite bank, but it reached farther than anything else available. If I could crawl across the trunk, perhaps I could leap the remaining distance onto a cluster of boulders near the far shore. It was dangerous, probably foolish, but so was everything else. I had just taken a step toward the fallen tree when the forest behind me went silent. Not quieter, silent. The river still roared beside me, but every sound coming from the woods ceased so abruptly that the absence itself became unmistakable. I slowly turned. Nothing moved between the trunks. Mist drifted lazily through the undergrowth where the evening air had begun cooling. The same enormous spruce stood exactly where they had always stood, their lower branches disappearing into shadows gathering across the forest floor. Yet I felt watched with such overwhelming certainty that the hair along my arms rose beneath my sleeves. My eyes searched automatically from tree to tree until they settled on a patch of darkness perhaps 70 meters away. Something blinked. Just once. A reflection. 2 amber points caught what little light remained before vanishing again. I froze. For several seconds nothing happened. Then slowly, the 2 reflections appeared again. Higher than any bear's eyes should have been. Farther apart than any wolf's. They remained motionless, watching. I found myself whispering without realizing it. No. The word disappeared into the river's roar. The eyes vanished. Not by lowering, not by turning away. They simply ceased reflecting light. I continued staring at the same place until my vision blurred, desperately hoping they would return and prove I had imagined them. Instead, I heard breathing. Deep. Slow. Somewhere within the trees. Not close enough to locate. Only close enough to know it existed. I backed away from the forest until my boots reached the riverbank. My heels slipped on wet stones, nearly pitching me into the current, and instinctively I turned toward the fallen spruce. Every second spent standing between the woods and the water felt like another invitation. I climbed onto the trunk without allowing myself another glance behind. The bark was slick with rain and coated in emerald moss that squished beneath my boots. Standing upright proved impossible almost immediately. The trunk narrowed slightly toward its broken end and rolled subtly beneath my weight, forcing me onto my hands and knees. Cold spray from the river soaked my gloves as I crawled outward above the racing water. Looking down had been a mistake on the suspension bridge. Here it was far worse. The current surged beneath me with terrifying speed, smashing against submerged rocks before exploding into white foam. Entire logs hurtled downstream only a few meters away, twisting violently before disappearing around the bend. One slip would place me into water cold enough to steal the strength from my arms within minutes. I concentrated on the rough bark beneath my fingers, moving one careful hand, then one careful knee, refusing to acknowledge anything except the next meter of trunk ahead. Halfway across, the tree shifted, only slightly, just enough that I stopped breathing. At first, I blamed the current hammering against the submerged branches. Then the trunk moved again, a vibration, rhythmic. Not from beneath, from behind, something heavy had stepped onto the opposite end. I closed my eyes for one brief second because I already knew what I would see if I looked back. Still, I looked. The near bank remained hidden behind branches where the trunk emerged from the forest, but I saw enough. The upper section of the fallen spruce was flexing, not from water, from weight. Something enormous had begun climbing onto it. I heard bark tearing. A low creak echoed through the wood beneath my hands. The realization struck with astonishing clarity. Trees carry vibrations extraordinarily well. Whatever stood behind me didn't need to see me. It could feel exactly where I was. Panic finally overruled caution. I scrambled forward as fast as I dared, bark shredding beneath my gloves while the trunk bounced faintly under alternating loads from opposite ends. 20 feet remained to the broken tip. 15, 10. The opposite bank still lay frustratingly beyond reach. I would have to jump. Behind me came another vibration, closer, heavier. The trunk dipped noticeably beneath my chest. Something had advanced several meters. I risked one last glance. I saw only an arm, nothing more. A massive dark forearm wrapped in coarse brown hair briefly appeared around the curve of the trunk before disappearing again behind a screen of branches. It was longer than seemed anatomically possible, ending in an enormous hand that gripped the bark with slow, effortless strength. I never saw the face, never saw the body. Somehow that single glimpse proved worse. My imagination filled in everything the branches concealed. I launched myself. The leap felt impossibly long. For one terrible instant, I was suspended above roaring water with nothing beneath me except white foam. Then my boots struck the first boulder. The rock was slick. My feet slid sideways. I slammed hard onto my shoulder, somehow catching another boulder before tumbling into the current. Pain exploded through my left arm. My backpack caught on the rock, stopping my fall inches from the water. For several seconds, I could do nothing except cling desperately to the stone while freezing spray soaked my face. When I finally dragged myself onto solid ground, I rolled onto my back, gasping for air. The fallen tree stood exactly where I had left it, empty, completely empty. The vibrations had stopped. No arm, no movement, nothing. I almost laughed from relief. Then I noticed something I had missed in my panic. The bark along the upper surface of the trunk had been stripped away in several places. Not broken, not scraped, compressed. As though something with an enormous hand had gripped the wood so tightly that entire sections of bark had simply peeled free beneath its fingers. 5 long impressions remained in the exposed pale wood. 5.
Perfectly spaced.
Still wet with fresh sap. I stared at them until a single deep knock echoed from somewhere far upstream. Another answered from downstream. The river had never been an escape. It had been another place they had wanted me to cross. And now, for the first time since leaving the meadow, I understood something even more frightening. They were no longer herding me back toward the truck. They were driving me somewhere else. I do not know how long I lay beside that river, staring at the stripped bark on the fallen spruce, trying to convince myself that I had not seen what I knew I had seen. Memory is a strange thing when terror gets involved. Some details become so sharp they seem carved into your mind with a knife, while others dissolve completely. I could not have told you exactly what time it was, nor how many kilometers remained between me and the truck. But I could have drawn those impressions in the bark from memory even now. 5 enormous finger marks pressed so deeply into living wood that the sap had already begun running down the trunk in pale amber streaks. They were not scratches. They were not claw marks. They were the imprint of a hand powerful enough to squeeze a mature spruce as though it were damp cardboard. I remember touching one of the impressions before I stood, placing my own hand inside it. My fingers reached only halfway across. That was the moment I finally stopped wondering whether I could somehow defend myself if the creature chose to attack. Until then, somewhere beneath all the fear, I had been quietly reassuring myself that I still possessed bear spray, a hunting knife, a loud voice, a reasonably strong body, the ordinary tools modern men carry to persuade themselves they remain near the top of nature's hierarchy. One look at that crushed bark ended the conversation. If that hand ever closed around my arm, there would be no struggle worth remembering. Evening had begun settling into the valley in earnest now. The clouds hanging over the peaks had thickened into one unbroken ceiling of dull gray, and beneath the trees the light had taken on that peculiar blue tone that comes just before darkness begins swallowing detail. The mountains seemed to retreat from me as visibility shortened. Distant ridges vanished first, then nearby slopes, until my world became little more than the narrow corridor immediately ahead. The truck no longer felt 18 kilometers away. It felt as though it existed in another lifetime. I checked my compass again, more out of habit than confidence, and turned southwest, determined to regain the hiking trail before full night arrived. I had abandoned it because I believed something was using it against me. But wandering blindly through untouched forest had become equally dangerous. At least the trail offered direction. At least it led somewhere. Every minute spent bushwhacking through deadfall and tangled undergrowth increased the chances that exhaustion or simple bad luck would finish what fear had started. The forest changed gradually as I climbed away from the river. The towering spruce gave way to mixed stands of lodgepole pine and trembling aspen, their pale trunks standing ghost-like among the darker evergreens. Fallen leaves, already beginning to yellow despite the lingering warmth of late summer, covered the ground in damp patches that muffled my footsteps. More than once I stopped because I thought I heard someone walking behind me, only to realize I had been listening to the echo of my own boots reflected strangely off the surrounding hillsides. My senses had become unreliable companions. Every shadow seemed capable of movement. Every broken stump suggested broad shoulders. Every breeze brushing through branches resembled whispered voices just beyond understanding. Yet beneath all those false alarms ran another certainty, one that refused to loosen its grip. The real danger would not announce itself until it had already decided the distance between us no longer mattered. I had been climbing for perhaps 40 minutes when I noticed something that should not have existed that far into the wilderness. It was subtle at first, little more than an unnatural straight line cutting through the trees ahead. Mountains rarely produce straight lines. They prefer curves, fractures, randomness. Curious despite everything, I pushed through a stand of young pines until the object revealed itself. A cabin stood in a small clearing no larger than a hockey rink, weathered almost silver with age, its log walls leaning slightly beneath decades of heavy snow. Moss climbed halfway up the timbers. One corner of the roof had collapsed years earlier, allowing young spruce saplings to grow through the interior. It looked abandoned, forgotten, as though the forest had been patiently reclaiming it one season at a time. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I almost laughed. Human construction, no matter how old, represented possibility. Shelter. Dry firewood if any remained inside. Perhaps even old emergency supplies. At the very least, 4 walls separated me from the surrounding trees. Then I noticed the doorway. There wasn't one. The opening where a door should have hung had been filled in with rough logs long ago. Not carefully, not by a craftsman, but hastily, as though someone had wanted the entrance sealed rather than repaired. I circled slowly around the cabin searching for another way inside. There were windows, but every one of them had been boarded over from the outside. Thick planks, darkened by decades of weather, crossed each opening with heavy spikes driven deep into the logs. Whoever had done the work had not been trying to keep weather out. They had been trying to keep something from coming in, or something from getting out. That thought should have sent me away immediately. Instead, it drew me closer. Fear does strange things to curiosity. I found myself examining the walls, noticing old axe marks beneath the moss, rusted hinges where shutters had once hung, fragments of faded blue paint protected beneath the eaves. Someone had lived here. Families, perhaps. Trappers, prospectors. Whoever they were, they had eventually abandoned the place, but not before taking extraordinary measures to seal it shut. I reached the rear wall where the roof had partially collapsed and found a gap large enough to squeeze through if I removed my backpack. Common sense argued against entering. Every instinct argued that remaining outside after dark would be worse. I slipped off my pack, pushed it through the opening first, then crawled awkwardly into the cabin. The air inside smelled of damp wood, old ashes, and decades of decay. My flashlight cut weak tunnels through the gloom, revealing a single room scattered with collapsed roof beams, broken furniture, and a stone fireplace blackened by countless long-forgotten fires. Ferns now grew where a table had probably once stood. Small animals had nested in one corner beneath fallen shingles. Water dripped steadily through the broken roof, each drop striking rotten floorboards with slow, patient rhythm. Despite everything, I felt safer almost immediately. Walls have that effect on people. They create the comforting illusion that danger exists outside, rather than simply beyond sight. I began gathering what remained of my thoughts. My watch still functioned. My compass still pointed faithfully south. My food bag held enough to last another day if absolutely necessary. My flashlight had spare batteries. I even considered spending the night inside the cabin, despite every warning my instincts continued whispering. Perhaps whatever hunted these mountains would eventually lose interest if I remained quiet until dawn. Perhaps daylight would restore enough confidence to find the trail properly. Perhaps... My light passed across the fireplace. I stopped moving. Someone had carved words into the stone mantel, not recently. Years ago. The letters had softened with age, but they remained readable. Do not answer them. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure whether my mind had begun inventing things that did not exist. I stepped closer and brushed away a layer of moss growing across the lower edge. Beneath the first sentence appeared another. If they sound human, keep quiet. A coldness spread through me unlike anything I had experienced all day. Those words had been left by another person. Not a story. Not a legend. A warning. Someone else had stood exactly where I was standing now, long enough ago for moss to begin swallowing the letters, and whatever they had encountered had frightened them enough to carve those messages permanently into stone before leaving. Or perhaps before never leaving. I backed away from the fireplace until my shoulders touched the opposite wall. The cabin seemed smaller now, the silence heavier. I suddenly became aware of how completely enclosed I was. No doorway, no visible windows, only one narrow opening through the collapsed roof where I had crawled inside. Then from somewhere outside the cabin, a voice called softly through the trees. "Hello?" I froze. It was a man's voice, clear, calm, close enough that it seemed to come from the edge of the clearing. "Anybody out here?" Every muscle in my body locked. Relief surged through me before reason caught it. Another hiker, a ranger, search and rescue. For one glorious second, I actually opened my mouth. Then my eyes drifted back toward the carved warning above the fireplace. "Do not answer them," the voice came again. Closer now. "Hey, I think I heard somebody." It sounded perfectly normal, friendly, almost familiar. Yet something about it felt subtly wrong. The rhythm, the pauses, as though whoever spoke had learned human conversation by listening from a distance rather than participating in it. I remained absolutely silent. The voice waited, then called again. This time, it used my name. Clint. My blood turned to ice. I had not spoken my name aloud since leaving the truck that morning. No one knew I was here. Outside, slow footsteps began circling the cabin, not searching, not hurried, simply walking, patiently, one full circuit, then another. Boards creaked softly beneath unseen weight just outside the log walls. The footsteps stopped directly beneath the collapsed section of roof through which I had entered. For several endless seconds, nothing happened. Then, very slowly, a single enormous hand settled over the edge of the opening. Long fingers curled around the weathered log, Fresh sap oozed where the wood compressed beneath their grip. And from just beyond the roofline, no more than a few feet above my head, the same calm human voice whispered into the darkness. "Clint, I know you're in there." I have been asked more than once, usually by people who have never spent a night alone in the wilderness, what the most frightening sound was during those 2 days in the Rockies. They expect me to describe the howls rolling through the valleys, or the impossible tree knocks, or the heavy footsteps pacing me through the timber. But they are always disappointed by my answer, because none of those things came close to what happened after that voice spoke my name through the broken roof of the cabin. The worst sound I have ever heard was the silence that followed. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds, perhaps a minute. I honestly do not know. Time had become meaningless by then. I only know that I stood frozen in the darkness, every muscle locked so tightly that my jaw began to ache, while the enormous hand remained resting on the edge of the collapsed roof only a few feet above me. It did not grope blindly. It did not search. It simply held the timber with effortless strength, as though whatever owned that hand already knew precisely where I was standing and no longer felt any urgency whatsoever. The voice had stopped because it had accomplished exactly what it intended. It had forced me to understand that I was no longer hiding. I was merely waiting. The first movement came from above rather than beside me. I heard old shingles shifting under tremendous weight, followed by the slow complaint of ancient rafters bending farther than they had bent in decades. Dust drifted down through the beam of my flashlight, glittering in the air like fine ash before settling across the ruined floorboards. Somewhere inside the roof, another timber cracked with the dry report of splitting firewood. The cabin had survived countless winters beneath heavy snow, yet it now groaned as though something far denser had climbed onto it. I switched off my flashlight instinctively. Darkness swallowed me completely, but at least it concealed me as well. The only light remaining filtered weakly through the collapsed section of roof, outlining the silhouette of broken rafters against the evening sky. I watched that opening without blinking, terrified that at any moment a face would slowly lower itself into view. Instead, the weight began moving, not quickly. One careful step, then another. The entire roof flexed above me. Old nails squealed inside seasoned logs. A shower of dried moss fell from between the timbers and landed silently on my shoulders. Whatever walked overhead moved with astonishing control for something so enormous. There was none of the clumsy crashing I might have expected from a bear exploring a structure. It placed each foot exactly where it intended, testing the roof with the confidence of something that understood wood, understood weakness, understood exactly how much pressure those century-old beams could tolerate before failing. I realized then that it wasn't trying to break into the cabin. It was listening. I held my breath until my lungs burned. Every instinct screamed at me not to move, not even to swallow. Somewhere above, the footsteps stopped directly over the center of the room. The silence stretched until I could hear tiny drops of water falling from the roof into puddles scattered across the floor. Then came a sound so faint I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A slow inhale, deep, measured. The unmistakable sound of something smelling the air beneath it. The voice returned, softer now. "Clint." It pronounced my name almost perfectly. Almost. There was something subtly wrong with the second syllable, as though the tongue forming it had practiced only by imitation. It reminded me of hearing someone speak flawless English after learning it entirely from old recordings. Every word was technically correct, yet something beneath the pronunciation felt strangely hollow, stripped of the tiny imperfections that make speech genuinely human. "You're cold." The sentence drifted through the broken roof. "I can help." My throat tightened painfully. It knew enough language to make promises. It knew enough to sound reassuring. The warning carved into the fireplace suddenly seemed almost inadequate. It should not have read, "Do not answer them." It should have read, "Do not believe them." The weight shifted again. This time it moved toward the rear of the cabin where I had crawled inside through the collapsed wall. My eyes darted toward the opening. If it blocked that exit, I would have nowhere left to go. Every other window remained boarded shut. Every other wall was solid log. The footsteps continued past the opening instead, They circled the cabin once more, slower than before, accompanied by the occasional scrape of bark against wood as though an enormous hand brushed casually along the exterior walls while passing. Then everything stopped, completely. No footsteps, no breathing, no voice, only the distant murmur of the wind moving through treetops beyond the clearing. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. My legs began trembling from remaining motionless so long. Eventually, another realization crept into my exhausted mind.
The thing outside wanted me to make the next decision.
It had cornered me without ever touching me. If I remained inside until morning, I risked being trapped. If I left now, I stepped willingly back into the forest. Either choice served its purpose. I closed my eyes and forced myself to think rather than react. Panic had carried me through much of the afternoon, but panic always spends itself eventually, leaving behind something colder and more dangerous. I pictured the map again. The truck remained somewhere southwest. The trail, if I could find it, eventually crossed an old fire road several kilometers farther on. Fire roads meant vehicle access. Vehicle access meant possibility. Remaining in the cabin offered none. Whatever hunted these mountains had already found me here. I made my decision. Slowly, carefully, I eased my backpack onto my shoulders, tightening every loose buckle beforehand so nothing would rattle once I started moving. I clipped the useless satellite phone back onto the shoulder strap almost automatically, a habit refusing to die even after the device itself had. My flashlight remained off. I would trust my eyes to the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds rather than advertise my position with a beam that could be seen hundreds of meters away. I crawled toward the collapsed section of wall, one agonizing movement at a time. Every rotten floorboard seemed determined to betray me. One creaked softly beneath my knee. I froze. Nothing answered. Another meter, then another. Finally, my hands reached damp earth beneath the broken logs where I had entered earlier. I slipped through. The forest greeted me with cool night air carrying the scent of wet pine and fresh rain. The clearing appeared empty. The cabin stood silent behind me. I waited several seconds, listening. Nothing. No movement. No breathing. No impossible voice. Keeping low, I crossed the clearing toward the shelter of the trees. Halfway there, I noticed something lying on the ground directly in my path. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch. Then moonlight broke briefly through the clouds. It wasn't wood, it was my hiking pole. The one I had lost nearly 4 hours earlier while scrambling across the drainage. I stared at it in disbelief. There was no possible way it could be here. I had dropped it at least 6 kilometers away. Yet there it lay across the grass, as though someone had carefully placed it where I could not possibly miss it. My stomach turned. It hadn't simply been following me. It had been collecting pieces of me. I stepped around the pole without touching it and hurried into the timber. Behind me, from somewhere inside the cabin I had just abandoned, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps crossing the rotten floorboards. 1, 2, 3. Then, in my own voice, perfectly, unmistakably my own, I heard the cabin whisper into the darkness. "Hello?" The single word echoed through the clearing exactly as I had shouted it back on the trail hours earlier. For one horrifying instant, I honestly believed another version of myself still stood inside that cabin. Then the voice called again. "Who's there?" It was repeating me, replaying my own words with flawless precision. Every frightened question I had asked the forest that afternoon. Every inflection, every pause, every breath. I did not look back, because by then I finally understood the terrible purpose behind the imitation. It wasn't trying to become human, it was learning, and I had been teaching it all day. People sometimes ask me why I never went back. They assume the answer is obvious, that after what happened, any sane person would avoid that valley forever. But the truth is more complicated than that. There are places in the world where terrible things happen because of chance, a rock fall, a flash flood, an avalanche. And those places eventually become ordinary again because nature has no memory. That valley was different. Long before I arrived, it had already been waiting. Long after I left, I have no doubt it continued waiting. The mountains were never the danger. They were simply the walls around something patient enough to let generations of hikers believe they were alone. I have spent countless nights lying awake replaying every decision I made, wondering whether I survived because I was clever, because I was lucky, or because whatever hunted me simply decided the chase itself had been enough. I still do not know which answer frightens me more. The forest swallowed me again as I left the abandoned cabin behind, moving as quietly as exhaustion allowed while the impossible echo of my own voice continued drifting from somewhere inside the ruined walls. It repeated only fragments now, a word here, a sentence there. Sometimes it sounded exactly like me. Sometimes the rhythm slipped just enough to remind me that whatever was speaking had learned the sounds without understanding the fear behind them. Once I heard my own laugh from earlier that morning, the brief, relaxed laugh I had made while crossing a stream before any of this had begun. And hearing that carefree version of myself echo through the darkness nearly broke me. It felt as though the forest had already begun erasing the real Clint West and replacing him with an imitation that would wander those trees forever, calling out to the next unsuspecting hiker who happened to pass through. Night settled completely over the Rockies with astonishing speed. Beneath the dense canopy there was no twilight, only a gradual surrender of detail until trunks became silhouettes and branches merged into one continuous ceiling of black. I dared not use my flashlight except for brief moments to confirm my direction. Every flash of light felt like firing a flare into enemy territory. I relied instead on the pale glow filtering through breaks in the clouds and on the compass that remained stubbornly faithful even as my confidence disappeared. I no longer cared whether I found the hiking trail. I cared only about maintaining one steady direction toward the trailhead. Somewhere beyond these ridges sat my truck. Steel, glass, an engine. Civilization condensed into 4 wheels. I repeated that image over and over until it became almost like a prayer. The hours that followed dissolved into an exhausting blur of climbing over fallen timber, sliding down wet slopes, stumbling through dense stands of young spruce that seemed determined to snag every strap on my backpack. My knees shook constantly now, not only from fear but from fatigue. More than once I caught myself drifting into strange waking dreams, where I imagined I was already sitting behind the steering wheel with the heater blowing warm air across my hands, only to snap back into reality when a branch struck my face or my boot plunged unexpectedly into cold water. Somewhere around midnight, I realized I had stopped hearing the knocks. The whistles had vanished as well. Even the distant howls no longer rolled through the valleys. That absence should have comforted me. Instead, it terrified me more than anything I had experienced since the meadow. Predators make noise when they need communication. Silence means they no longer do. I reached the old fire road shortly before dawn. At first, I didn't recognize it. The narrow strip of gravel emerging from the forest looked almost unnatural after so many hours beneath thick timber. Grass grew through much of its center, proving it had not been maintained in years, yet tire tracks remained faintly visible beneath the damp surface. I actually dropped to one knee and pressed my hand against the gravel to convince myself it was real. Human beings had built this road. Vehicles had traveled it. I had reached something connected, however distantly, to the ordinary world. I laughed then, not because I felt safe, but because I suddenly believed survival might still be possible. The trailhead lay perhaps 5 kilometers farther south, 5 kilometers on a road instead of through tangled forest, 5 kilometers that no longer required climbing over deadfall or squeezing between moss-covered boulders. 5 kilometers. I had covered perhaps one of them when I noticed the footprints. They appeared in the thin layer of mud left by the night's rain. Bare, enormous, walking directly down the center of the road. Not fresh enough to glisten, not old enough to have softened. My optimism evaporated so completely that it almost felt physical. I crouched beside the nearest print. It matched every other track I had seen throughout the previous day, yet these differed in one crucial way. They all pointed south, toward the trailhead, toward my truck. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared around a gentle bend in the road. It had gone there before me. I remained crouched for a long time, trying to decide whether turning back into the wilderness made more sense than continuing toward whatever waited ahead. Eventually, practicality overruled fear. My truck represented food, warmth, communication, speed. Even if something had reached it first, I possessed no better alternative. I stood, tightened my grip on the bear spray that by now felt little more threatening than a can of paint, and continued walking. The eastern sky gradually lightened through the trees. Dawn arrived slowly, washing the mountains in pale silver before touching the highest peaks with muted gold. Birds began calling again for the first time since the previous afternoon. The ordinary sounds of the forest returned one by one, until I almost convinced myself that everything had finally ended. I rounded another bend. There was the parking lot, empty except for my truck. It sat exactly where I had left it. Windows intact, nothing appeared disturbed. I stopped walking. Something felt wrong. It took several seconds before I understood what my eyes had noticed before my conscious mind. The driver's door stood slightly open, only a few centimeters. I knew with absolute certainty I had locked it, every door, every time. My legs carried me forward despite every warning echoing inside my head. 20 meters, 15, 10. The truck looked perfectly ordinary. The keys still hung from the small magnetic box beneath the rear bumper where I always hid the spare. Nothing had been stolen, nothing damaged. I reached the driver's door and slowly pulled it open. The interior smelled exactly as it had the previous morning. Coffee, old upholstery, pine air freshener, and something else. Wet cedar. Resting neatly on the driver's seat was my satellite phone. Clean, dry. Its screen illuminated the moment I looked at it. A full signal, full battery. No damage whatsoever. Hands trembling uncontrollably, I picked it up. The display showed only one unread message. There was no sender, no timestamp, only 6 words. Next time, don't leave the trail. For several seconds, I simply stared. Then I heard it. One slow knock. Somewhere deep within the forest behind the parking lot. Another answered from high on the mountainside. Then a third, much closer. I climbed into the truck so violently I nearly tore the door from my hand. The engine fired on the first turn of the key, and I backed out of the parking lot faster than I had ever driven on gravel in my life. Stones exploding beneath the tires as the truck fishtailed toward the narrow mountain road leading back to civilization. I never looked into the rearview mirror. I told myself there was no reason to. I told myself I was finally escaping. Nearly 20 kilometers later, after the mountains had begun opening into broader valleys and I had regained enough control over my breathing to believe I might actually survive, I glanced at the mirror for the first time. No vehicle followed me. No figure stood in the road. Nothing. Then, just before the highway curved away from the Rockies entirely, I noticed one last thing. High on a distant ridgeline silhouetted against the morning sky where no human could possibly have climbed so quickly, stood a single enormous figure. It raised one arm, not waving, not threatening, simply acknowledging. As though the chase had never been about catching me, only proving that it always could have. I have never returned to that valley. I sold the satellite phone. I burned every map that marked the route. I never even told the park wardens exactly where it happened because I could not bear the thought of watching search helicopters disappear into those mountains, looking for evidence they would never find. But every autumn, when the first cold rain begins tapping against my windows late at night, I sometimes wake convinced that I can hear 3 slow knocks somewhere beyond the walls of my house. They are always far away, always patient, always separated by the same impossible silence. I never look outside anymore. Because some lessons once learned in the Canadian Rockies stay with you for the rest of your life. And somewhere beyond those endless forests, in a valley 30 kilometers from the nearest truck, I cannot shake the feeling that something still remembers my name and wonders whether one day I might decide to come back